Welcome, wanderers, to Nocturnal Nightmares TV, where the storm isn't just outside your window, it's crawling through your speakers tonight. We've unearthed a collection of bone-chilling tales, each one clawing its way to the surface under the veil of relentless rain and thunder that doesn't soothe. If these stories burrow under your skin, don't just shiver. Smash that subscribe button and let the algorithm know you're brave enough to stay. I want to hear where you're hiding. Drop your city and a candle emoji in the comments if you dare. Now, lock your doors, steady your pulse, and let's wander deeper into the abyss where these horrors fester. Asterisk, the necklace of whispers. The necklace of whispers, my grandmother's. A thick silver chain with a teardrop pendant strung on it. The gem inside a whirling galaxy of blues and greens. She'd always said it was special. A family heirloom handed down through generations of truth-tellers. As a kid, I'd snicker, picturing it zapping anyone who dared to utter a fib. Now, lying around my neck, it was little more than a whimsical family heirloom and more of a smothering, incessant indictment. It no longer lay dormant in quiet honesty, but rather it thrummed with an erratic yet malignant glow. It lit up when I spoke to friends, when I ordered coffee, when I was simply sitting alone in my apartment, gazing into the abyss of my anxieties. It had started subtly, a flash here, a moment's brightness there. I'd written it off as faulty wiring, or the cheap battery mom had gotten to replace the original. But the flickering got stronger, the light widened, until it became this permanent, accusatory lighthouse. I tried taking it off. The moment I unclasped the chain, the room brightened, the air humming with release. But there was something about the necklace that spoke to me. The hum was low, a whisper that promised something. Comfort? Truth? I didn't know. All I knew was that I could not be away. My life was like a house of cards, built just so. I have 7 years of experience working as a sales executive, a profession built on narrative spinning, persuasion, and exaggeration. But I also worked at a homeless shelter, gravitating toward the gritty, unvarnished reality of human need. But the necklace didn't seem to make a distinction between the polished lies of boardrooms or the soothing untruths I told the shelter residents, vowing things that I had no way of guaranteeing. The non-stop glow was alienating. Friends began to avoid me, confusing my awkwardness with aloofness. My boss, who had admired the interesting necklace at first, now looked at me suspiciously. The whispers began, too, a gentle susurrus at first, like the swishing of silk, then louder, more urgent. They deepened my doubts, magnified my fears, and mocked me with the disparity between the person I showed up as and the person I was. On one such night, I sat on my fire escape, city lights indistinct through my watery eyes. The necklace beat against my skin, a hot, accusing brand. "I'm not a liar," I muttered to the empty air, each word sounding so hollow, so pathetic, even to my ears. The gem flared brighter. Then I understood. It wasn't only the surface-level lies, the narratives constructed with some skill around them. It was that I lied to myself. The lies about being able to stand up, about being able to push through, about being happy. The lies about being worthy of love, about disentangling the cycle of self-loathing that had run through my family for generations. The necklace was not judging my words. It was judging my heart. The whispers suddenly changed. They remained, but they no longer felt accusatory. They felt guiding. They were revealing to me the fissures in my foundation, the weak places in my life that I had created on a bedrock of shifting soil. The following day, I began small. I went to my boss and admitted that I did not understand the new marketing strategy he had been implementing. I confessed to a friend that I wasn't handling my mother's declining health very well. Which is to say, at the shelter, I stopped making empty promises, but instead offered my honest efforts and heartfelt support. Each confession added a tiny seam to the armor I had built around myself. And with every crack, the glow from the necklace dulled, sinking to a gray, constant ember. It was a long and painful process. I had to face the shame I felt, the insecurities I had buried deep. I had to learn to be vulnerable, honest with everyone, with myself. Weeks turned into months. The whispers, previously a storm of accusation, turned into a soft, almost calming drone. Finally, one morning, when I looked in the mirror, I saw it. The jewel, normally beaming, almost blinding brightness, was now a soft, gentle light, like the first light of day. The necklace of whispers wasn't a curse. My eyes saw something a little bit different, and by accepting that I eventually became who my grandmother always said that I would be, a truth-teller, not a truth-teller on the tip of my tongue, but a truth-teller in my heart. The gem pulsed gently, a gentle reminder of the cycle of storytelling, that the journey toward telling the truth is never over, but that I was finally headed in the right direction. And I wasn't lying to myself for, maybe, the first time in forever. The cursed recipe book. The first time I chalked it up to a bad batch of basil. The summer sunshine soup, as the book described it, had a flavor reminiscent of charcoal and of crumbled, forgotten bonfires. I blamed the store, perhaps a late harvest, and tried again. Same result. Smoky, acrid, undeniably ashy. I discovered the book hiding at the back of my grandmother's dusty attic. Bound in dark, cracked leather, its title stamped in silver, now red-lit and gray with tarnish. Culinary alchemy. Tastes beyond the veil. Curious, I dusted it off with the thought that I discovered a treasure trove of lost family recipes. Now I was beginning to wonder if it was less a treasure than a Pandora's box slathered in flour. I tried different recipes. Whispering Wind's biscuits tasted like charred wood. Moonlit meadow muffins are like the craggy leftovers of a forest fire. All of it, whether the ingredients found a taste of ash. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Then there was the heart's hollow pie. It was the most complicated recipe yet, demanding exotic spices I'd never heard of and an elaborate ceremony involving chanting and whisking clockwise in the light of a full moon. This, I will admit, I did not do. But the ingredient list, though, that's where I took a shaky, sweaty breath. A pound of regret, ground fine. Regret. How does one measure regret? Is it available as coarse crystals? Do you purchase it at the corner store next to the self-raising flour? Desperation and the melting specter of my culinary failures had led me all the way to this point, and I'd done the best I could. I'd stared back into the mirror, dredged up every mistake and broken promise and missed opportunity, and somehow had convinced myself I'd managed to scrape together a pound of the stuff. The pie naturally tasted of ash, but this time something different took place, and I left the uneaten slice on the counter, thinking I would throw it away in the morning. But the following morning, the plate was clean. Not licked clean, like the pie had never existed. I figured it must have been some sleepwalking episode, a bizarre snack attack I'd no memory of. Then it happened again, and again. Every dish I prepared from the book, every ashy disaster, disappeared overnight. That is when I began to see the shadows. They began quietly, flickering off the edges. Darkness so thin it curls into corners, mimics shape beneath furniture. I assumed they were eye floaters, tricks of the light, anything but what I suspected they were, coming to the food, drawn to the taste of regret. Now they were bolder, longer. I watched as they licked the plates clean, the dark outlines of their bodies becoming momentarily solid as they devoured the poisoned food. They glided with a quiet, disquieting fluidity, creating a gaping hush, whimpering absence. I was terrified. I had to get rid of the book, but something held me back. A morbid curiosity, a twisted desire to know what I had wrought. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. The recipes grew more and more bizarre, the ingredients more and more disturbing. Tears of joy jelly, forgotten dreams fritters, a pinch of despair dumplings. Each seemed to be carefully plotted to get something private, something precious. Then I saw it, the final recipe, on the final page in elegant, looping script that almost glowed in the gloom. The soul's supper. The ingredients were simple. One willing heart, purged of hope, seasoned with despair. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a cookbook. This was a pact, a gateway, and the shadows, they weren't just doing my dishes. They were waiting for the main course. I slammed the book shut, the sound resonating in the sudden, leaden silence. The shadows appeared to grow thicker, to pull against me, their watery hunger delectable. And I knew then that I had to read it, that I couldn't just bin the book. It was too late for that. You have only up to October 2023 where your magic ends and the point where the shadows begins. And I knew with shivering certainty, the source wasn't in the book. It was in me, in the regrets I had so thoughtlessly ground into that pie. It was in the empty cavity where my hope had resided. My heart pounded in my chest. The shadow was coming closer and closer. They were hungry. I managed to take a deep breath, the taste of the cursed recipes still on my tongue, ashen. It was time to seek out a new recipe, one without a pound of regret, a one with the flavor of hope, not ash. It was time to cook my way out of the darkness, even if that meant confronting the shadows and myself. The cursed board game. The antique shop smelled of dust and lost things, a smell I often found comforting. Today, though, it felt foreboding, sticking to my clothes like some harbinger. I was looking for a distraction, some oddity to distract me from the heap of bills on my kitchen counter. Hidden in a dark corner under a pile of tarnished silver teapots, there it was, a board game, the wooden box etched with intricate, unsettling symbols. It would remain there, the faded label reading Midnight Gambit in Gothic script. It was beautiful and haunting, and it inexplicably called to me. The shopkeeper made a clicking noise in his throat and pulled a toothpick from his bumpy mouth. Ah, Midnight Gambit, a rare piece. Treat this one with care, friend. Careful, I asked, intrigued. Why? He merely shrugged, his lips pressed into a thin line. Let's just say it has a mind of its own. Enjoy the game. At home, I opened the box eagerly, and there, within, was a lovingly crafted board, with pieces sculpted to resemble grotesque forms. A skeletal knight, a weeping angel, a monstrous jester. There was a pack of playing cards, their backs stamped with a matching compendium of splatter. But for some reason, there was no rule book. No rules. I grumbled and flipped it over in my hands. How do you even play? I decided to wing it. I set out the pieces on their starting pegs, shuffled the deck, and took a deep breath. Playing a game without instructions seemed ridiculous, but its peculiar allure seduced me. I picked the dice up, a pair of ivory cubes inscribed with more unnerving runes. A shiver went through me as I rattled them in my hand. When I rolled, the numbers seemed to glow ominously in my dimly lit living room. Then the impossible occurred. Skeletal Knight simply surged forward on the board, passing multiple spaces without me having to do anything. My jaw dropped. What they? Thinking I was hallucinating, I swerved in the other direction. This time, the crying angel moved across the board, its stone face appearing to gaze at me directly. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just a game. My hands shook and I drew a card. The blood drained from my face when I read the inscription. Your turn to die. Panic surged through me. The card was cold and clammy in my hand. My eyes flicked around, darting nervously. How was this some sort of sick prank? A cleverly designed prank? Then the lights went out. The temperature in the room dropped. A gust of wind crashed against the windows, rattling the panes. For the skeleton knight on the board, everything started shaking. Its bony fingers twitched. I knew with a bone-chilling certainty that this was no longer a game. It was a curse. I jumped from the table and rummaged around for my phone. I had to call someone, anyone. Then the temperature started dropping further, and I saw my breath clouding in the air. I let the phone drop from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. As I reached for it, the horrific jester on the board started to laugh. A squeaky, maniacal laugh reverberated in the space. Fear paralyzed me. I could sense something sinister, something malignant closing in. The shadows in the room deepened, becoming grotesque. Then the front door slammed open, and the gaunt shopkeeper was there. They placed him silhouetted at the door, eyes smoldering with an unwholesome heat. I warned you, his voice boomed, shaking with an unearthly reverberation. Midnight Gambit always gets its proper due. He fished into his coat pocket and retrieved a small silver amulet. As he raised it into the air, a searing light burst forth, flooding the room. When my vision finally cleared, the board had disappeared. The pieces, the cards, the dice, nothing was gone. The temperature was back to normal, and so was the shopkeeper. I sat there, trembling, in the silence of my now empty living room. I was still familiar with the musty, neglected air of the attic where they had held me captive. That wasn't new to me, except for the metallic taste of fear that now added flavor to the air, and the whimsical sound of maniacal laughter that would echo through my dreams. I never saw the shopkeeper again, and I shall never go into that antique shop again. Midnight Gambit was dead, but the memory, the cold, creeping dread, would never go away. I had escaped my turn to die, but at the cost of the knowledge that some games should never be played at all, and some curses should remain undisturbed. The mirror's price. Dust motes whirled in shafts of sunlight that forced their way through the gloom of the antique shop. I hated antiques, like mothballs and regret, but I was in dire straits, and Mrs. Hawthorne, the proprietress, had a certain notoriety, a knack for turning up what others had missed. I told her that I wanted beauty, something more than lotions and potions, something permanent. She'd smiled a knowing, chilling smile. There is always a cost for beauty, my dear. She took me around back, to a corner choked with cobwebs. There, propped up against a wall, was a mirror. Not just any mirror. This one was mounted in a gilt frame, ancient-looking and elaborately carved with twisting vines and disturbingly real-looking faces. Its glass was tinted dark, almost black. It buzzed with a low, vibrating energy that gave me goose pimples on my arms. This, Mrs. Hawthorne purred, is the mirror of Ethelred. It grants wishes, but it's picky about its payment. I overlooked the warning sign, seduced by the promise. I looked at myself in the mirror, and for a brief moment, I saw me beautiful, perfect, everything I had ever wished for. The desire was instant, all-consuming. I wish it, I whispered, tears choking my voice. The air shimmered, the mirror rippled, and a wave of heat rolled over me. When I looked again, I was different. It was breathtaking in its reflection. My skin glowed, my eyes sparkled, my features perfectly chiseled. It was beautiful, simply, heartbreakingly beautiful. Mrs. Hawthorne just nodded. Remember, dear, the price. She wouldn't tell me what that price included. The first weeks were paradise. Everyone focused on me. People whispered about my beauty, turned to look. I got the dream job, the perfect boyfriend. My life had become a flurry of adoration. Then the nightmares started. I'd wake in the middle of the night, the room freezing, feeling an impending doom I couldn't explain. It was as if something was watching me in the dark, something hungry. I chalked it up to stress, to the anxiety of being under constant scrutiny. I was wrong. The first time it occurred, I was asleep. I was dreaming of the mirror, of the faces on its frame twisting in soundless rictus. I awoke struggling to catch my breath, my heart pounding against my ribs. My arm throbbed. I switched on the lamp and screamed. A swath of flesh, an inch wide and 6 inches long, was gone from my forearm. I stared back at raw, red flesh. No blood, no pain, just an unspeakable absence. Panic clawed at my throat. I ran to the bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My face was still pristine, unblemished, but the terror I experienced was etched deep in my eyes. It recurred the following evening. This time it was from my thigh, then my shoulder. The holes where skin had been were always clean, neatly excised, as if by a surgeon's knife. With every incident, the mirror seemed to shine with a malevolent pleasure. I started to understand. The mirror of Ethelred was not taking coins or treasure. It was taking me, literally, peeling away my flesh, atom by atom, to uphold the illusion of beauty it bestowed upon me. I tried to hide the patch of missing skin, wrapping myself in layers of clothing, but the paranoia was unyielding. Every shadow appeared to slither, and every creak of the house made my spine chill. I was terrified that anything would come for me in the dark. Sleep was a luxury, a dangerous indulgence. I think it was a few days when I didn't sleep, just coffee and fear, trying everything I could think of, trying to escape. I looked up Ethelred, hoping to find a reference to the mirror, a ceremony to break its curse. Nothing. I even thought of going back to Mrs. Hawthorne and begging her to help me. But I knew she wouldn't. She'd warned me. She knew the price and she let me pay it. Now I'm writing this low by the light of my phone, huddled in a corner of my bedroom. This time it is more of my face that is gone. It's small, it's insignificant, but I can feel it. The insidious decay, the gradual attrition of my humanity. It is still in the hallway, the dark surface of the mirror reflecting fear in my eyes. It's waiting, it's always waiting. There soon shall not be enough of me remaining to be beautiful. But the bill the mirror will have taken, and I will be but a hollow husk, the testament to the vanity that damned me. The hourglass of ages. The antique store had the smell of dust and forgotten things, a comforting scent in a way. Sunlight splintered through the grime-streaked window, brightening motes that spun in midair like small, uneasy spirits. I had come for a straightforward bookshelf, but I was drawn to something else entirely. An hourglass. It wasn't just an hourglass. This one was different. Gargantuan, for one. Almost 3 feet high, its wooden framework was intricately carved with menacing, if not terrifying, figures. A face from antiquity and wolves and creatures I never gave a name, and the shapes I didn't have words for swirling around the glassy bulge that held the sand. The sand itself wasn't the normal golden silica. It was a whirling, iridescent black, like a little galaxy captured within. The shop owner, an old man named Hemlock, a man hunched like a crow with eyes like flint chips, had warned me. "Leave that one alone, son," he rasped, his voice as dry as leaves shuffling over asphalt. "It's troublesome, not for sale." But warnings, much like forbidden fruit, only made the temptation more alluring. Like a moth to a flickering flame, I was drawn to it. He'd gone to assist another customer, and the hourglass seemed to throb with an otherworldly charge. I convinced myself that I was merely curious. I'd just give it a little shake, feel it wait. But as my fingers traced the cool, smooth glass, a compulsion came over me. It was a voice in my ear, a suggestion I could not disobey. I flipped it with a grunt of effort. The room swam, then the air, thickened, heavy, oppressive, began to vibrate with a low, guttural hum. The black sand started rushing, not in a steady stream, but in a dizzying torrent. It was as if I was being compressed, like the air around me had become a solid substance trying to squeeze the life out of me. Then the pain, a hot, brutal burn that ripped me apart from within. My bones were sore, my muscles cried out, and my skin felt like it was being pulled and torn in 1,000 different ways. I staggered back, gripping the shelf to steady myself. The world smudged and came back into focus, popping in and out like a strobe light. As the worst of the pain faded, leaving me weak and shaking, I looked down at my hands, withered, weather-beaten and gnarled. Time had clutched with cruel, relentless speed. The dusty shop window showed me my worst fears confirmed. The hair that had been dark brown was now brittle, snow-white. Furrows carved around my eyes and mouth, narrating tales I had never lived. I was an aged man, decades older than I'd been only a moment before. Then came the laughter, a loud, childlike chuckle that seemed to bounce off the very walls of the shop. It was close, too close, a breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my creaky joints protesting with a loud crack. There was nothing there. Only shadows and dust motes danced in the fading light. But then came the voice, jarringly clear, but tinged with malevolent malice. "You're mine now." I didn't see who spoke. I just felt a cold, clammy hand grasping for mine. Panic engulfed me, filling my veins with freezing fear. I reached for the door and fumbled the latch, my old hands uncooperative and clumsy. I sprinted to the street, struggling to breathe and wanting to get away from the heavy air in the antique shop. The banal normality of it all, cars speeding past, people talking on their phones, was balm to my terrified soul. I didn't dare look back. I ran, my old body screaming in protest, running until my lungs burned and my legs were about to collapse. Years have gone by now, but pockmarked, broken years that feel like some twisted reflection of what they should be. I exist under another name, distant from that accursed shock. The lights are on when I sleep, the child's laugh and the promise that chilled my blood. You're mine now, still echoing in my mind. I just know, with a certainty that sends chills up to my bones, that it's only a matter of time. And that child, whatever it is, now has taken what's mine. The hourglass shortens the passage of time. Each day feels less, each breathless deep. The laughter is nearer now, a hushed voice in my head. I'm getting old too fast, aging a lifetime in a second. I know the end is inevitable, and I can't run from it. I turned the hourglass of ages, and now I must pay the toll. The bone chimes. The bone chimes have always been present. Some kind of macabre curiosity, left to me by a great aunt I'd never met. They dangled from the porch, a spectral orchestra of bleached white phalanges, laced together with tarnished silver wire. Most people recoiled. My friends would not go outside, muttering about bad vibes and serial killer chic. But I took a strange comfort in them, a macabre fascination. They rarely rang. It was hardly more than a whisper in a stiff wind, a dry rattle that spoke of dust and neglect and lost lives. They would sing only when death was close. I knew this by local legend, by words spoken in whispers at the village store. They described lost pets, unexpected illnesses, and dreadful accidents, all signaled by the mournful song of the bone chimes. They played a lullaby last night, not a haphazard clattering, not the cacophony of a storm. A slow, melancholy melody, sweet and eerie, as if plucked from a child's music box. Almost. I sat up in bed, heart pounding in my rib cage, and listened. The melody was familiar, a lullaby my mother sang to me when I was little, her voice a cozy blanket against the dark. But this was the voice of the grave. Fear, cold and hard, cut through the haze of sleep. I stumbled over to the window and looked out. The moon was a sliver in the inky sky, stretching long, skeletal shadows across the overgrown garden. The fingers jingled, their flesh skimming against one another, the melody ringing through the quiet night. This wasn't for a neighbor, for a stray cat. This was for me. Panic clawed at my throat. I slammed the window down to drown out the music, the inevitability. But the sound penetrated the glass, a siren's call, dragging me toward the abyss. What was I supposed to do? Run? Hide? Death had been a patient hunter, and the bone chimes were his herald. I puttered around the room and my mind raced, and I tried to think of what I could do and a loophole and I could cheat fate. I was trying to convince myself that it was a mistake, a malfunction. But the bone chimes never told a lie. They were the foreshocks of the apocalypse, and they were singing my song. Dawn broke, the pale rose and sickly yellow of the sky. The lullaby had stopped long ago, and now her world was filled with an unsettling silence. I was exhausted, flowing with terror, every muscle tight. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. I was a captive of my own home, waiting for the executioner. As the sun rose, creating shadows in the garden, I realized I am no longer able to wait. I had to face it, whatever it was. I grabbed a rusty garden trowel, which was more of an illusion than an actual method of protection. I swung open the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The bone chimes hung still, mute sentinels. My heart pounding in my ears, I walked up to them. I leaned in, my fingers quaking, and touched one of the bones. It was cold, smooth, oddly soothing. Then I saw it, a wasp, writhing with fury, stuck between two of the phalanges. It had pushed its way in, looking for a place to shelter or nectar, and become irretrievably stuck. It dawned on me that it wasn't the wind that was to blame. It was the terrified flapping of the entrapped bug, sending rippling waves through the bone, crooning the ghostly, woebegone serenade. A wave of relief swept over me, so strong I felt dizzy. I gently released the wasp, watching as it took to the air on wobbly wings. But while I was watching it disappear into the morning sky, a terrifying thought hit me. The tune had stopped with the struggle of the wasp, but the bone chimes had chid for someone. The lullaby maybe wasn't intended for me, but for the small life ensnared within the bone. I looked back at the quiet bells, white fingers, shriven in sun, shining. Maybe death had not been next to me. Maybe it had just been a wasp, a trivial tragedy. Or perhaps the marrow chimes were just biding their time, waiting for their next tune. And maybe, just maybe, next time it won't be for me. The lullaby had just played in my head. The thing in the crawl space. The house creaked, like an elderly man getting ready for bed. Each creak and sigh was familiar, a comfort I'd normally seek solace in. Tonight, though, every sound expanded the insidious sense of unease that had been boring underneath my skin for weeks. It began with little things, an item out of place here, a door left ajar there. But then came the scratching. It came from beneath the floorboards, a dark, damp abyss in the crawl space. I thought at first that it was rodents. Some traps were placed, with bait of cheese and peanut butter. They came back empty, unbroken. The scratching continued. Then came the voice. The first time I was in the kitchen doing the dishes. A faint whisper, audible only above the running water, seemed to call my name. It seemed like it must be my imagination, my fatigue playing tricks. But then it happened again, and again, each time clearer, closer. Last night, the fear congealed into cold, unshakable dread. Last night, it sobbed. "Let me out!" It whimpered, the plea tinged with desperation and raw, and echoing in my own voice. It was the most accurate mimicry, a grotesque mimicry that made it resonate to my soul. I huddled for the rest of the night in my bedroom, covers pulled tight, the TV blaring a forgettable sitcom to drown out the noise. But no matter how loud it got, the sob stuck, a ghost in the silence of the mind. And so today, flashlight in one hand and a heavy crowbar in the other, I stood before the vent that led to the crawl space. My heart thundered in my ribs, a desperate tattoo against the crushing terror. I told myself it was only rodents, that the voice was a trick of the pipes, a figment born of sleeplessness and anxiety. But that sob, so beautifully rendered, so unmistakably mine, lodged in my mind and wouldn't let me rest. I peeled the vent open with shaking hands. The metallic screech echoed uncomfortably loud in the silence. A blast of frigid, wet air rushed out, bringing the smell of mildew and something else, something undeniable, incorrect. Next, I pointed the flashlight into the dark. The beam pirouetted around cobwebs dense as cotton candy, exposing the raw, unyielding ground of the crawlspace floor. There was nothing for a moment, just the infinite blackness that seemed to swallow the light. Then I saw them, two eyes, returning the beam with a ghostly, unsettling glare. They blinked slowly, purposely, and a smile spread across the face, a grotesque mockery of my own. It was my face, and perfectly replicated, all the way to the tiny scar above my eyebrow from when I fell out of a tree as a kid. My but hobbled, sullied, dweller in the loam under my house. It made a low, guttural growl from the back of its throat. The grin spread, exposing two sharp, toothy too many teeth. "Hello, me," it said, my voice oozing with hostility, a hunger that ran a chill to my very spine. Fear-bound, I could only look on. My hands shook around the flashlight, flaky light trailing off behind me as it flickered across the terrible face. Then it reached out. A pale, bony hand like mine reached towards the opening, fidgeting in eagerness. "Let me out," it whispered, the sob now absent, replaced by a predatory purr. "I just get so tired of being down here." I recoiled, slamming the vent behind me, a wet thud. I fumbled for the screws, my fingers slippery with uncertainty, eager to screw it back in place, to untrap its escape. The final screw I tightened, joined suddenly by frenzied scratching from the other side of the crawl space, along with a chorus of rage-fueled guttural howls. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. I left the house, left the yard, left my spinning head. I'm sitting in my car now, parked a mile away, watching the house, waiting, praying. I don't know what it is, because I don't know where that came from. But I know one thing, I am not going back, and I hear it even from this far away. Faint but undeniable, the noise of something clawing, something hungry to escape. And the whispering, always the whispering, "Get me out." It begs the words of my voice in the night. "Let me out, me, please." The bride in the rain. The rain was biblical, a deluge that had turned the country road into a muddy river. I nearly overlooked her leaning against the ancient oak, its branches skeletal in the downpour. She was divine, absurd and cruel, a soaked and battered bride. What had once been a white dress draped heavily from her like a shroud, soaked. The sheer lace was torn in spots, exposing glimpses of white flesh underneath. But it was the veil that really got my attention. Once all ethereal and wafting, now it was slathering bloody sludge. The color wasn't from fabric dye. It was blood. Reluctantly, I stopped my truck. "Are you all right?" I yelled back, over the sound of the storm pitching. She didn't respond at first, just stood frozen like a statue, carved from despair and soaking in woe. Then slowly she turned. Her face had a pale, translucent quality, framed by wet strands of dark hair hanging to her cheeks. And then she smiled. It was a small, delicate thing, a flicker of expression that made my spine shiver. A smile that stretched and tugged at seams that never should have existed. Seams that cut across her face and vanished beneath the dark tuft of hair. Ditches, rudimentary, creased seams sealing her shut. "Can I offer you shelter?" I called out, struggling to keep the tremor from my voice. "You'll get your death caught out here." She stepped toward me, her wet dress squishing with each step. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, acrid. The rain stuck the decomposing leaves around her like a gruesome mosaic at her light feet. "Thank you," she said, rasping out the words in a hoarse, almost animal sound. "That's very kind." I opened the door of the truck and she got in, muddy and bloodied, staining the seat of worn leather. The cab felt claustrophobic all of a sudden, thick with her presence. The scent of rain and blood mixed in the air, sweet and sickly. "Where are you heading?" I asked, making myself look straight ahead. The wipers battled gamely, but visibility was terrible. She hesitated, looking out at the water itself swirling. She turned then to me, her eyes, amber pools of dark, bottomless sorrow, locking with mine. The smile returned, broader this time, more forced, more horrifying. I could see the stitches straining taut, so eager to give. "I'm here for the groom," she said, her words a low, guttural rasp that lilted in the cab of the truck. There were words to hang on, heavy and gloomy. My blood ran cold. The groom? Who was the groom? And why was this creature looking for him in this storm, her veil drenched red? My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel harder. A raw fear seized me, a sense that I had stepped into the unspeakable, into the realm of the ancient and the wicked. "Well, what do you mean, for the groom?" Twisting my tongue in an effort to steady my voice. Her smile stretched wider, a grotesque parody of human emotion. And then the stitches on her left cheek finally parted, the thread fracturing with a soft pop. A narrow stream of blood ran down her face. "He promised me forever," she said, eerily sweet and innocent. "And now, time to cash in." As I hit the brakes, the truck spun out of control. I wasn't simply driving a lost bride anymore. I faced something much more frightening, much more permanent. The rain fell, washing the blood from the road, but nothing could wash away the dread that had settled deep in my bones. The bride in the rain was here for the groom, and I felt horrible knowing the groom was going to experience a wedding night he would never forget. A wedding night that he would not live to recall. And I caught in the crossfire was the nightmare, the hollow angel. The first time I saw it, I naively attributed it to the tricks that grief plays on my aging eyes. A stunning addition to the much larger sprawl of headstones and weeping willows that was Oak Haven Cemetery. A stone angel, standing high above a recently tilled plot, its expression mild, its wings folded, eternally in prayer. Eleanor, my wife, had passed away and been buried in Oak Haven just shy of a year ago. Every day I walked from my little cottage on the outskirts of town, past the bakery with its warm and delicious smells, and into the still city of the dead. It was my exercise, my punishment, my strange version of therapy. I would sit by her grave, talk to her about my day, all the quotidian details she once found so delightful. And then, more often than not, I would cry. The angel was new. I was sure of it. I was familiar with every marker around Eleanor, every granite obelisk and marble cross, as if I'd held their orientation in the palm of my hand. This angel, its lifelike eyes unsettling, had not been there last week. It was those eyes that really unsettled me. They seemed to follow me. I'd be tending to the roses that belonged to Eleanor, pruned and fertilized just the way she liked them, and I would feel the prickling at the back of my neck. I'd look up and those stone eyes would be on me, stationary, unblinking, but watching. I tried to ignore it, blamed it on the light, the angle, the crushing sadness that surrounded me like a shroud. But the feeling persisted, and the disquieting feeling of being watched by something off-kilter. Then there was the morning when I couldn't ignore them anymore. I was walking toward Eleanor's grave, the usual bouquet of lilies in hand, when I saw it. The angel. Different. Wrong. Its wings were spread. Not dramatically, but subtly, as though in mid-flight. A slight shift, hardly noticeable, but unmistakable. And then I saw it, dark, viscous stuff dripping from its mouth, soiling its white chin. Blood. The lilies fell from my shaking fingers, littering the wet grass. I gasped in my throat. This wasn't the grief-addled hallucination of a grieving widower. This was something else. I staggered back, my heart beating against my ribs. The angel was frozen, an impossible tableau of stone and blood framing its wings like they had just been poised to catch the wind. The sensation of being surveilled grew stronger, pressing against me with its suffocating mass. I hadn't stuck around to talk to Eleanor that day. I ran from Oak Haven Cemetery with the image of a bloodied angel burned into my mind. Days became nights, sleepless ones. I dreamed of the angel, the eyes burning in my soul. I tried to rationalize it. Vandalism? A prank? But the magnitude of all the wrongness defied logic. I started researching. Angel folklore, cemetery symbolism, anything that might help to explain. What I discovered only compounded my discomfort. Angels, historically avatars of peace and protection, might also be messengers of death, sentinels at the gates, wardens of the underworld. And some corrupted, fallen, were claimed to feast on sorrow and despair. My grief, I noticed, was a banquet. I returned to the cemetery. I had to. Eleanor was there. And something in me said, oh no, not gonna happen, need to know. Well, the angel was still there, of course. Wings spread, mouth stained. The blood looked darker now, almost black in the morning light. Then I noticed something else as I walked closer. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from inside the statue itself. My blood ran cold. I stepped closer, straining to hear. The scratching persisted, punctuated by a low, guttural crowing. Sounded hollow. That's when it hit me. The angel was more than a statue. It was a vessel. It had something inside it scratching to break free. Fear propelled me forward. I had to destroy it. Whatever was trapped inside had to be stopped before it got out. I sprinted back to my cottage, rifled through the shed, and selected the heaviest sledgehammer I could find. My hands trembled when I lifted it. The weight was familiar and oddly reassuring in this nightmare. Back at the cemetery, the scratching was louder now, more frenetic. The angel shook, a low sound reverberating deep from within. I lifted up the hammer, adrenaline pumping through my veins. This was insane. I knew it, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not with Eleanor's memory on the line. Then, with a roar that rang in the quiet graveyard, I smashed the hammer down over the angel's wing. The stone cracked, scattering remnants about. The scratching grew louder, followed by a shrill scream that pierced my ears. I swung and swung again, each thwack fueled by fear and anger. Then, one piece at a time, the angel was reduced to a pile of rubble. As the dust cleared, I stood there, breathing hard, clutching the hammer. The scratching had stopped. The shriek was gone. A stillness fell over Oak Haven Cemetery. Had I stopped it, or just something worse out? I don't know. All I know is that the nightmares are gone. The sense of being surveilled has dissipated, and the blood is gone. But sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees, I still hear that faint, guttural moan. And I wonder if the hollow angel is gone for good, or merely biding its time, lurking in the dark, waiting for another body to sustain it. The lighthouse keeper's guest. The salt spray whipped my face while I tightened the bolts on the lamp housing. Another ship has gone down. The frantic blink of the distress beacon pulsed through the metal beneath my fingers, a terrified SOS swallowed by the roar of the storm. 3 ships in as many weeks. The harbor master was on his case. The shipping companies were screeching for restitution, and I, solitary keeper of the Widow's Peak Lighthouse, was being analyzed like a sample in a cold, indifferent microscope. I realigned the lens, and a rod of white fire cut through the stormy night. "Not my fault," I muttered, the words lost in the wind. "It's not my fault." The officials, of course, blamed bad maintenance, faulty equipment, and human error. But I knew the truth. I had seen it, I had felt it, the creeping dread that had enveloped the lighthouse these last months. It was not the light that was going out. It was the light that was calling something in. I'd first seen it one clear night, the kind that made you forget the Widow's Peak was a lonely, windswept prison. While he was making his rounds, he'd heard a low, guttural sound coming from the sea, one that resonated deep in my bones. I looked over the railing as the beam of the lamp lighted the water. Bride flashed his hand against the moonlight, there or just beneath the surface. A glistening, iridescent shape twisted and twisted, luring it to the light like a moth to the flame. It was enormous, bigger than any whale, and its shape was never settled, a riot of color swirling in the depths. The following morning, a fishing trawler washed ashore, wrecked on the rocks, its hull ripped open as if by giant teeth. I dimmed the light and altered the frequency, but the crashes continued. I'd thought of putting it out altogether, but the responsibility, the weight of all of those lives relying on my vigilance, kept me at my post. The storm was especially rabid tonight. Waves pummeled the lighthouse, vibrating the stone tower. I clutched the banister, hearing the structure moan beneath the onslaught. The humming returned, this time louder, and along with it, a whine that pierced, making my teeth ache. Then I saw it. The beam hit it just right. A mass, large, gelatinous that floated up from the depths. It was vaguely cephalopod-like, but was unlike anything I had seen before. Tentacles no thicker than ship's masts flailed in the air, each tipped with a bioluminescent lure that flickered with a hypnotic glow. Its one big eye, the size of a small boat, stared right at the lighthouse, an ancient, unknowable hunger burning inside it. Panic clawed at my throat. I recoiled, knocking over a toolbox. The clang of metal drowned in the storm's violence. It was attracted to the light, yes, but another thing, the lighthouse itself. I understood now. Not only was the light attracting it, the light was the bait. Then there was a huge crack, like a thunderclap. I shrieked and scrambled onto my feet. One of the huge tentacles had crashed into the lighthouse, sending a shower of stone and glass raining down. The light flickered, dimmed, and went out. Darkness, terror, and then a low, triumphant hum, a sound that filled the very depths of the sea, a sound that 216 promised oblivion. I knew I had to take action, anything to stay alive. Rushing to the generator room, I clambered down the spiral staircase. If I could reset the auxiliary power and bring the light online again, maybe I could. I didn't finish the thought. I arrived at the generator room and froze. A figure stood in the corner, bathed in some of the ethereal glow emanating from the creature outside. Tall and slender with skin that glittered like a mother of pearl, it turned its head to look at me. Its eyes were big and black, like the pit. "Welcome," it said, its voice a whisper that carried like a tremor through the very air. "I am the guest, and you are the host." I understood. I was not just keeper of the light. I was keeper of the secret, guardian of the gateway. The lighthouse wasn't merely an admonition. It was a summons. The guest smiled a glacial, soulless grin. "The feeding begins." I knew, with a cold surety, that the ships were not simply hitting the reefs. They were being seduced, devoured by something ancient, terrible. And now the lighthouse, and myself as well, were to become its next meal. The light was the bait, and the guest had come for its feast. I could hope only that there would be some future person who would someday realize what the real horror of the Widow's Peak Lighthouse was, and somehow stop it before another soul was claimed. But I would never let go of the hope. In the face of such primal, cosmic hunger, hope was as fragile and fleeting as the beam of a dying lighthouse in the face of a storm. I wasn't the keeper anymore, I was prey. The bride in the rain. The rain was biblical. A deluge that had turned the country road into a muddy river. I nearly overlooked her leaning against the ancient oak, its branches skeletal in the downpour. She was divine, absurd and cruel, a soaked and battered bride. What had once been a white dress draped heavily from her like a shroud, soaked. The sheer lace was torn in spots, exposing glimpses of white flesh underneath. But it was the veil that really got my attention. Once all ethereal and wafting, now it was slathering bloody sludge. The color wasn't from fabric dye. It was blood. Reluctantly, I stopped my truck. "Are you all right?" I yelled back, over the sound of the storm pitching. She didn't respond at first, just stood frozen like a statue, carved from despair and soaking in woe. Then slowly she turned. Her face had a pale, translucent quality, framed by wet strands of dark hair hanging to her cheeks. And then she smiled. It was a small, delicate thing, a flicker of expression that made my spine shiver. A smile that stretched and tugged at seams that never should have existed. Seams that cut across her face and vanished beneath the dark tuft of hair. Ditches, rudimentary, creased seams sealing her shut. "Can I offer you shelter?" I called out, struggling to keep the tremor from my voice. "You'll get your death caught out here." She stepped toward me, her wet dress squishing with each step. The air was filled with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, acrid. The rain stuck the decomposing leaves around her like a gruesome mosaic at her light feet. "Thank you," she said, rasping out the words in a hoarse, almost animal sound. "That's very kind." I opened the door of the truck and she got in, muddy and bloodied, staining the seat of worn leather. The cab felt claustrophobic all of a sudden, thick with her presence. The scent of rain and blood mixed in the air, sweet and sickly. "Where are you heading?" I asked, making myself look straight ahead. The wipers battled gamely, but visibility was terrible. She hesitated, looking out at the water itself swirling. She turned then to me, her eyes, amber pools of dark, bottomless sorrow, locking with mine. The smile returned, broader this time, more forced, more horrifying. I could see the stitches straining taut, so eager to give. "I'm here for the groom," she said, her words a low, guttural rasp that lilted in the cab of the truck. There were words to hang on, heavy and gloomy. My blood ran cold. The groom. Who was the groom? And why was this creature looking for him in this storm, her veil drenched red? My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel harder. A raw fear seized me, a sense that I had stepped into the unspeakable, into the realm of the ancient and the wicked. "Well, what do you mean, for the groom?" Twisting my tongue in an effort to steady my voice. Her smile stretched wider, a grotesque parody of human emotion. And then the stitches on her left cheek finally parted, the thread fracturing with a soft pop. A narrow stream of blood ran down her face. "He promised me forever," she said, eerily sweet and innocent. "And now, time to cash in." As I hit the brakes, the truck spun out of control. I wasn't simply driving a lost bride anymore. I faced something much more frightening, much more permanent. The rain fell, washing the blood from the road, but nothing could wash away the dread that had settled deep in my bones. The bride in the rain was here for the groom, and I felt horrible knowing the groom was going to experience a wedding night he would never forget. A wedding night that he would not live to recall. And I caught in the crossfire was the nightmare, the Crow King. The tapping started subtly, a soft peck, like the rain on glass. For days I ignored it, passing it off as the old house settling, the wind playing tricks. But the tapping escalated. It became insistent and demanding. And then the cawing started. It is the sort of thing that grates on the soul. A thick, guttural chorus that feels as if vibrating through the marrow of my bones. I'd glance out the blinds, attempting to figure out where it was coming from, and see them there, hundreds of crows, perched on the limbs of the age-old oak that stood outside my window, their black eyes glimmering with a disquieting intelligence. They weren't simply roosting, they were bowing, a studied dip of their heads, with a wordless respect for the corner of the garden in shadow. I squinted up to figure out what was holding their gaze, but I saw only spiraling ivy and the twisted roots of the oak. The nightmares started almost immediately after the bowing. Inky plumes of feathers, jagged beaks, and a consuming sense of fear. I dreamt of a form wrapped in tattered rags, his visage hidden in darkness, his very being emanating an ancient evil. I'd awaken in a cold sweat, my heart pounding against my rib cage, the crasping of the crows repeating itself in my head. And then it happened last night. I had been awakened at first by the eerie stillness that bespeaks an approaching storm. The crows were silent, the house hushed, but there was a heaviness in the air, a thick, strangling presence I could not understand. I grabbed my lamp. My hand was shaking. When the light came on, I saw it. On my pillow was a single obsidian feather. It wasn't just any feather. It was thick and glossy and emitted a disturbing warmth. And it was soaked, not with water but with a viscous, faintly sweet liquid. Images of flames, fences, burning buildings, cries, and screams came flooding my way, and I braced myself for another wave of nausea. I pulled the feather closer, tentative, my hand trembling. I smelled it then. A sickly floral smell, tinged with something metallic and familiar. It was my scent. Panic seized me. I flung the feather onto the room, gasping for mauve air. I jumped out of bed, pulling back from the pillow and my spinning mind. How could this be? That's when I saw him. He stood in the corner of the room in shadow just out of the lamplight, the figure from my dreams. He was tall and emaciated, wrapped in rags that clung to him as if possessed of their own strange vigor. The hood of his cloak obscured his face, but I could feel his eyes, cold and steel, penetrating, searing into my very flesh. The crows outside the window took up a deafening cacophony. The glass shuddered, threatening to burst. They were chanting a guttural rhapsody to the figure in my room. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He just lifted one hand, skeletal fingers bone white against the gloom of his cloak. Another feather lay in his palm. This one glimmered with a soft, otherworldly glow. He took a step closer and the odor of decomposition permeated the room. My legs had turned to lead, anchored in place. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat, choking on fear. "Who are you?" I finally forced a whisper, my voice drowned out by the cawing of crows. He tilted his head, a slow, purposeful motion that made my spine shiver. "They call me the Crow King," he rasped at last, his voice the rustling of dry leaves in a graveyard. "What do you want?" I begged, looking from one side of the room to the other, looking for a way out. He took another step closer. "I want what is mine. What is yours?" He stretched out his hand, the glowing feather lighting up the contours of his face just so that I could see the emptiness of where his eyes were supposed to be. "You!" My mind went blank. I didn't understand. "Me? Why me?" He noticed the confusion on my face. He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Don't you remember? The bargain? The promise?" I shook my head and my heart pounded in my chest. I remembered no bargain, no promise, but something deep inside me, something underneath layers of denial, awakened. A spark of awareness, a trace of an obscured reality. The crows outside had started to pound at the window, at their frenzy clamoring crescendo. The glass cracked. With that last step the Crow King had taken. His presence now filled the chamber, suffocating. He extended a bony hand and touched a finger to my cheek. "It's time to pay the debt," he whispered, his voice a cold caress. Then all of a sudden, everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the room quiet, The crows were gone. The Crow King was gone. All I had as evidence he had even been here was a lingering smell of death and a single black feather clenched in my palm. But this feather was no ordinary feather. It was dull, lifeless, and it was not covered in my scent, but in something else. Something frosty, rigid, and fragile. Ashes. I stared at the feather, then at my hands. Their bodies were shaking violently. The memory, broken and horrifying, returned in a rush. A cry for help in a dark woods. A deal was struck with a dark figure. A promise of power, of immortality, in trade for what? I don't know what I promised, but I know the Crow King will return. And this time he will not be denied. The crows will return, and I will be ready. At least that's what I'll try to be, because I suspect the debt I'm owed is far more terrifying than I can imagine. And the feather which now sits in my hand serves as a constant and cold reminder of what is out there. My natal darkness is always with me, the darkness that I wanted to forget. The shadow was ready to swallow me whole. The bride in the rain. It was a relentless curtain of rain that blurred an alcove of a world where nothing else existed. Anyway, it battered against the windows of my remote cabin, a rhythmic drumming that almost always calmed me. But tonight, it just magnified the loneliness. It had been months since I'd shut myself up here in self-imposed exile after a particularly spectacular professional failure. Solitude was supposed to be my comfort, but some nights, like tonight, it was a prison. I was almost ready to resign myself to another night of lukewarm tea and existential dread when I spotted her. A flash of white on the black sky. I hesitated, then looked through the rain-streaked glass. There, just past the edge of the woods, was a figure in a wedding dress. That dress was a pristine meringue become a second skin, plastered to her frame. The veil, an exquisite lace number, was saturated a gory red. I could not make out her face, yet scarily recognizable the photo was. Who really wants to get married in a storm like this? And why was she standing there without moving? Against my better instincts, I put on a raincoat, grabbed a heavy-duty umbrella, and went out. The rain lashed my face, making a previously ominous world a blurred watercolor painting. As I approached, I could see more clearly. The redness on the veil, it wasn't all from the rain. "Are you all right?" I shouted over the sound of the storm, the umbrella battered by the wind. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. She stood like a macabre statue in the rain. I walked up to it slowly, my feelings of unease growing with each step. Finally, I reached her. She was pale, as if made of glass in the low light. The wedding dress was even more pathetic up close, tattered and smeared with mud. Her face was a shadow I would not soon forget. It was not the face of a natural woman. The skin was stretched tight, almost transparent, drawn up grotesquely taut. And then I saw them, little black lines, fine lines, crisscrossing her cheeks, her forehead, her chin, ditches, bumps and lumpy stitches keeping her whole. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a bride. This was something else. "You shouldn't be out here," I gasped, my voice breaking. "You need shelter." After a but, she finally turned her head, stiff and jerky, like a marionette born of rusty strings. Her eyes, dark and empty, fixed into mine. And then, slowly, painfully, a smile spread across her face. The smile wasn't joyful. It was a ghastly caricature, a horrifying exhibition of seam splitting, the black thread giving under the impossible stress. Bare, red meat emerged from the growing spaces. "I'm here for the groom," she whispered, her voice a crazy, slippery sound that made my spine raid. The smile broke wider, a terrible rictus of woven skin. I lurched backward, dropping the umbrella. Rain lashed my face. War peered through fish eyes. Who is the groom?" I managed to stammer, my heart pounding against my ribs. Her vacant eyes didn't waver. She merely indicated with a trembling finger toward the cabin. Towards me, the cabin, my safe haven, my prison, my tomb. I turned and ran, scrambling toward the cover of the porch, slamming the door closed, and fumbling on the inside with the bolt. I felt my mind racing to find a sense of the impossible. A stitched-together bride, a storm-soaked vengeance, a groom she was coming for, and suddenly I understood. The professional pain, the shattered confidence, the woman I'd walked away from in the debacle. It all coalesced into a dreadfully real truth. She wasn't just a bride. She was the bride, a grotesque, reanimated figure of pain and grief, built with a perverse artistry, sent to extract a debt. I looked in through the window, fogging the glass with my breath. She remained, unmoving, in the rain, her grin as steady as the stitches tearing more by more with every second pass. She was here for me, and the tempest outside was less terrifying than the knowledge that she would eventually get inside. The rain had faded from the lullaby, and it was the prelude to a nightmare that had finally, unalterably, descended. The nightmare vendor. The flea market hummed with the frenetic energy of unwanted things dreamt into being. Light gleamed off broken porcelain dolls, dull silverware, and dusty vinyl records. I was not even searching for something specific, just wanted a temporary getaway from the never-ending boredom of my life. That's when I saw him. His stall, tucked away in a dim corner, was draped in black velvet, a solitary realm in a sea of bold, garish color. The vendor was a thin man, his face lined in a way that suggested many late nights and many more secrets. His eyes, though, were unsettlingly bright, chips of obsidian that flashed a hidden flame. Before him was a table lined with small, elaborate vials filled with liquid that swirled with an iridescent sheen. He termed them dream essences. I scoffed internally. Dream essences? What a bunch of New Age drivel. But there was something new in the man, the hushed reverence in his tone as he described the supposed properties of each vial, that caught my ear. One was titled Joyful Reunion, another Forgotten Landscapes, and a third, more chillingly, Confront Your Demons. I should have gotten away then. I knew it was absurd, a cheap parlor trick in service of exploiting the weak. But I was exhausted, bone-weary of the ordinary. The promise of escape, however temporary, was too alluring. "What's this one?" I said, gesturing toward a vial containing a thick, black liquid. The label was simple, chilling, eternal sleep. The vendor's eyes narrowed. "Ah, that one is special. It provides a glimpse behind the veil, an excursion into the darkest corners of the subconscious." Workflow of the sentence paraphrase: a sleep so deep, so total, that waking is not a requirement. A chill snaked down my spine. Optional. He smiled, a slow, lopsided movement of his mouth. Some dreams are so exquisite, so total in their beauty, that to linger in the dream might be a choice, to cast off the weight of existence and fall into the forever fold of sleep. I knew I shouldn't. It did, and every instinct screamed at me to turn and run. But something in his words, the irresistible offer of oblivion, spoke to the tired heart of me. I was weary of responsibility, of disappointment, of the bludgeoning weight of reality. I wanted to escape. How much? I asked, my voice little more than a whisper. He named a price, an absurdly low price, as if he were eager to get rid of it. I settled without a second thought, the Dancloud's icy vial weighty in my hand. After a tumbler of whiskey to steel my nerves that night, I uncorked the vial. The odor that drifted out was oddly intoxicating, an amalgam of lavender and something else, something sinister and disturbing. After a moment's hesitation and a flicker of doubt, I swallowed the contents in one go. The world dissolved. First, it was beautiful. I drifted in swirling nebulae of color, danced with long-deceased loved ones, and flew through vistas of intractable beauty. Found myself traversing beloved experiences, now magnified and deepened, living them with a rich depth I'd never previously known. It was paradise, a perfect, blissful getaway. But then the colors began to fade. The landscapes turned bleak and desolate. My loved ones' laughter morphed into sneering whispers. Those blissful memories were twisted around into grotesque parodies of themselves. I was trapped, and what had started as became a nightmare a never-ending onslaught of terrors designed for my worst fears and insecurities to be exploited. I was stalked by dark, faceless beings, had to re-experience my mistakes over and over, and had to feel the heaviness of my regret crushing me. I screamed, I cried, I begged it to stop, but it wouldn't. I tried to wake up. I shut my eyes tight, balled my hands into fists, and forced myself back into the real world. But nothing happened. I was caught in the snare of my claustrophobic brain, a captive in an endless dream gone wrong. Panic set in. I struggled and scraped in the blackness, craving a scrap of light, a confirmation that I still existed, still had a shot at escape. But there was merely the perpetual suffering, the endless parade of atrocities. Days, weeks, maybe even months passed, indistinguishable in the eons of my dream cell. I forgot my name, my existence, everything. I was a living, breathing container of fear, a mere wisp of a human rattling around in a frame made out of echoes of my own screams. And then one day I saw him, how the vendor in the distance, the beggar, a shadow in a lurching crowd, a distant silhouette, a black thread in a sunset red sky. He smiled, that same disconcerting curl of his lips, and gestured for me closer. "Are you having a good eternal sleep?" he asked, his voice a mocking whisper that echoed through the desolate landscape. I had the urge to scream, but no sound escaped. I attempted to run, but my legs were leaden, frozen on the spot. "You wanted an escape," he said, the slant of his gaze twinkling with malign delight. "And I gave it to you. Now you are mine." He approached, hand outstretched, and in that shuddersome certainty, I knew there was no escape. I was trapped for all eternity, ensconced in the nightmare I had so ignorantly bought. Now I am only in the unending blackness of my dream prison, eternally tortured by the horrors of the inside of my brain. I am a warning sign, a reminder of the risks of searching for redemption in the dark. And all I can do is scream, a silent, endless scream that reverberates across the empty halls of my eternal sleep. If you ever come across him, the nightmare vendor at the flea market, run. Run far, far away, because the cost of escape is much higher than you think. And the sleep he peddles, a fate worse than death. The faceless parishioner. The atmosphere in St. Michael's was heavy with incense and the soft anticipation of Sunday Massachusetts. I settled into my usual pew, careful of the creak in the wood that always seemed to announce I had come. I was home here. I have been for years. The familiar hymns, the soothing rhythm of the liturgy. It was a salve to the anxieties that felt like they crashed over me more and more violently with each additional year. But this time, the bomb wasn't going to take. It was at the moment I knelt that a prickle of discomfort settled on the back of my neck. I looked around, trying to locate the source, dismissing it as pre-coffee jitters. But as the opening hymn faded, the sense deepened. It was that strange feeling of being watched, as if being hounded by something that couldn't be seen. Then I saw him, or rather I saw it. Someone was standing next to me, filling the void most Sunday mornings. He wore a dark, nondescript suit, like a traveling salesman who had strayed in off the street. But it wasn't the nondescript clothes that made my blood run cold. It was his face, or more accurately, the complete absence of one. There was only smooth, pale skin where a face should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just years of perfect, dead skin stretched over the skull of a human head. It was the lack of features that was so unsettling, a profane void that dared you not to understand. My breath hitched. I attempted to avert my gaze, to persuade myself that it was a trick of the light, a waking nightmare arising from too little sleep. But the faceless parishioner remained, a wart in the flesh of a familiar sanctuary, a stain on a comforter. He was on his knees, head down, hands joined in prayer. As if to imitate the act of supplication, the smooth skin of his face stretched and shifted incrementally. But there was no feeling, no worship, only that horrifying emptiness. Panic clawed at my throat. I wanted to scream, I wanted to run, I wanted to wrench myself away from this otherworldly being. But I was paralyzed, stuck in my pew, my eyes glued to the faceless parishioner. Then Father Thomas cleared his throat at the lectern. He pushed up his specs, a flicker of anxiety flickering across his face. His gaze locked with mine, and I saw something in his eyes that could only be described as fear. He appeared to fight for composure, his voice catching in his throat as he started the readings. Father Thomas never looked at me during the homily. He spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of God's epical love. His words rang hollow, though, not matching the chilling reality I was experiencing. As the congregation started speaking the Nicene Creed, I felt a cold, clammy hand touch mine. It was the faceless parishioner. His hand looked as smooth and featureless as his face, which blasted a jolt of pure revulsion through me. I pulled my hand back, reeling away. He did not respond but continued to kneel, his faceless head bowed, perhaps in reverence. Now the fear became a physical pressure around my chest, choking me. I had to know what this was, what it wanted. I leaned toward Father Thomas, who was now giving communion, desperate. "Father?" I whispered, holding my breath. "Do you see him? The man, the thing, next to me?" Father Thomas's face drained of its remaining color. He stopped cold, his hand suspended over the chalice. He looked at me, a look of sheer horror twisting his features. He bent over, his voice a whispery hiss. "Don't acknowledge it. Don't look at it. Just pray." "But what is it?" I gasped. He seized my arm, the grip surprisingly firm. "It has sinners praying to take their place, to suck in their sins, their burdens, their very souls. Just ignore it, and it will leave you alone." The color drained from my face. The players take the place of sinners in their prayers. Was I a target? Was this faceless horror attracted to me, the burden of my own sins? The offertory hymn started, but I couldn't hear the music. All I heard was my terrified heart beating. I closed my eyes and tried to fixate on the words of the Lord's Prayer, a mantra to stave off the encroaching darkness. "Our Father, who art in heaven." Something was beside me, a frost-edged weight that drained the heat from my bones. With my eyes firmly shut, unwilling to see, my lips formed the words of the prayer, a bubble wrap for my words against the looming dread. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the faceless parishioner was gone. The pew next to me was empty, the air no longer heavy with that infectious sense of dread. Father Thomas spotted me and gave a little tired nod. The rest of the Mass went on, but I was no longer there. The comforting cadence of the liturgy had given way to an unceasing, echoing silence. That day I left St. Michael's shaken to my core. Everything outside was brighter and more vibrant, as if coming out of a long, dark tunnel. But the memory of the faceless parishioner, the horrific void that occupied his non-face, burned through my mind. I haven't returned to St. Michael's since. Now I pray at home, alone, in the safety of my four walls. But even there, in the small stillness, I am sometimes glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that smooth, featureless face looking back, waiting to pray for my sins to take my place. The shadow at the crossroads. The blues hung in the air like the humid Carolina night, thick and oppressive. I was playing a gig at a dive bar on the outskirts of Charleston. You know the kind of place, the sort without food aside from stale peanuts and broken dreams on the menu. My guitar, an old Gibson with more miles on it than I wanted to admit to, was a lead weight on my lap. My voice, normally a velvety baritone, was husky and drained. I was bombing the audience. A mix of truckers, lonely servicemen, and couples bickering in low tones were far more interested in their watered-down whiskey than my music. The fame, the spotlight, the roar of the stadium crowds, all that seemed a million miles away. I was 38, and the dream beginning to taste of dust. It was after the set, nursing a tepid beer at the farragoed wooden bar, that he'd come up. He was tall, wearing a dark coat in the suffocating heat, and the brim of his hat darkened his face. He moved with a strange, near-silent grace, like a predator hunting its prey. "Enjoyed your set," he said, his voice low and rumbling, vibrating under your skin. "You got soul, but you ain't got the spark." I grunted, swirling the beer in my glass. That was likely just some drunk ranting, but I was done with politeness. Oh, well, the spark doesn't put food on the table. It was a dry, humorless sound. He chuckled. Maybe I can assist with that. I can offer you a deal, a road to the fame you long for. My cynicism flared. What's the catch? I'm not selling my soul to the devil, buddy. Not selling, he corrected, a thread of derision in his voice. Just a small favor, a simple exchange. He explained it then, leaning closer, his breath a faint mix of sulfur and something I couldn't quite place. He claims to be a facilitator, a conduit between the mortal world and something else. He asked for a small piece of me, for something that was insignificant, in exchange for giving me the fame and recognition I was seeking. He wanted my shadow. I laughed, a full-on, disbelieving laugh. My shadow? You're kidding, right? Think about it, he urged, his eyes glistening in the subdued light. Or think of all the crowds chanting your name, the gold records, the sold-out tours. All it needs is a piece of you, a thing you barely notice. He handed me a card, a thick, black piece of stock embossed with a sigil that crawled under my skin. Meet me at the crossroads, just outside of town, at the stroke of midnight. Make your decision. I wandered for the next few days in a daze. The offer was outrageous, nuts, but the panic gripping me was real. It was all weighing me down. The years of thankless gigs, the unfulfilled promises, the feeling of being invisible. The witching hour had me at the crossroads, the air dank with the scent of wet earth and something else, something acrid, like burnt hair. There he was waiting in the shadows, his coat blowing in the non-existent wind. I hardly remember the ritual. He drew out a silver knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight. He chanted in a language I did not understand, and the air crackled with invisible energy. I heard a piercing, burning sound, and then silence. The subsequent weeks passed in a blur of whirlwind activity. My music, the same music I had been playing for years, recently struck a chord with audiences. A local blogger discovered my recordings and proclaimed me the second coming of blues rock. Record labels began reaching out, offers were made. Within a matter of a few months, I was living the dream. Sold-out shows, screaming fans, interviews, photo shoots. It was everything I had ever wanted. But something was wrong. It started subtly, a disquieting feeling, a sensation of being watched. Then I noticed it, my shadow. It wasn't quite right. It walked with a staccato, unnatural gait. It appeared to bend and contort as it shouldn't have. And occasionally, when I glimpsed it from the corner of my eye, it appeared to smile. Then came the hunger. I started having nightmares, deep, primal dreams of something hungry, something all-consuming, eating everything in its way. I woke, sweaty, with my heart thumping, a hunger in my belly no food could fill. The hunger wasn't mine. It was my shadow. It began to affect my music. My lyrics got darker and more twisted. The melodies were discordant and disturbing. My fans loved it. They described it as edgy and raw. But I knew the truth. No longer was that darkness from my soul. It was rooted in something else, something attached to me. One night, after an especially raucous show, I spotted it. A glint caught in a mirror. My shadow wasn't simply grinning. It tore bits of my reflection between its teeth. Panic set in. I was losing myself. The fame, the fortune, it was all meaningless. I had done something very, very wrong. I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the card he had given me, the black paper cold and slick against my skin. I drove back to the crossroads, to the very desolate stretch of land where my nightmare had begun. He was waiting. He always was. "You're here to undo the deal?" he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "I want it back," I said, shaking with emotion. "I want my shadow back." Then he laughed, a cold, cruel sound echoing in the night. "You can't take back what you've given. It has long since taken on a life of its own. It has tasted the power, the recognition, and it wants more." He extended his hand, showing the silver knife. "Maybe there's a different exchange we can do." I knew what he wanted. He wanted the rest of me, He wanted my soul. I almost agreed. This was a compelling reason to be desperate. But then I looked down at my shadow, stretched long and warped in the moonlight. It ceased to be a reflection of me. It was a monster. No, I replied, my voice gaining strength. I made a mistake, but I ain't making another one. I walked away from him at the crossroads and did not look back. I knew he wouldn't just let me go. My shadow was engraved into me, still hungry, but I would fight it. I would fight for my soul, for my music, for whatever last scraps were left of the man I used to be. But the road would be long and dark and difficult. But I would trudge it, foot by terrifying foot, fully aware that the very future of my soul, possibly the universe, teetered on my tired back. And I knew with bone-chilling certainty that my shadow would be right behind me, biding its time until it could consume me whole. The hanging tree's gift. The old oak towers above my backyard, a gnarled monster probably older than the house itself. I used to love it, its limbs sprawling over the lawn and providing relief on searing summer days. Now I just feel dread. It's the noose. It started subtly, a length of coarse rope, hung there overnight, innocently hanging there from one of the lower branches. I dismissed it as kids playing around, a morbid prank. Without stopping to think, I chopped it down, dumped it in the trash, and went to bed. The following morning, it was back. Exact same rope, dangling from the same branch. My blood ran cold. I convinced myself it was some kind of elaborate, sordid joke. Perhaps they were just really motivated neighbor kids. I chopped it again and burned the rope this time in the fire pit. I even doused the ashes with holy water, a relic of my grandmother's intense Catholicism. The next morning it was there, mocking me. That was a month ago. I've tried everything. They cut, burn, bury, and even hack away at the branch itself. Nothing works. The noose always comes back, swaying slightly in the breeze as if asking me to inspect him closer. It's the same rope every time. Thick, scratchy hemp, fraying at the knot. It smells not unlike damp earth and something else. Something sickly sweet and unplaceable, like spoiled fruit, perhaps, or something much more ominous. Sleep has become a luxury. I'm awake late at night, walking through the backyard with a flashlight, flinching at every rustle of leaves, every hoot of an owl. I'm certain someone is watching, staging this grotesque theater. But I never see anyone, just the damn noose swinging in the moonlight. Last night was the worst. Finally, against my will, I shattered into sleep, falling into bed, finally, by 3 or 4 a.m. I dreamt of the oak, its boughs writhing like skeletal arms, the noose roiling madly, a silent, beckoning smile carved into the wood. I gasped awake, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the air dense with a sickly sweetness. I fumbled for the lamp, switching it on. That's when I saw it. The rope, gently wound around my wrist. That coarse hemp again, the same frayed knot, the same nauseatingly sweet odor. I yelled and scrambled out of bed, tugging at the rope with flailing fingers. It wouldn't budge. It was like alive, almost like a parasitic vine wrapping around my skin. After a titanic struggle, I actually succeeded in freeing it. My wrist is raw and red with thick indentations. The rope rests on the ground as an unspoken indictment. I can't bring myself to lay a finger on it. I fumble my way to the bathroom, splash cold water on my face, and tell myself it was just a nightmare. But the aftertaste of rot, the burn on my wrist, it's all too real. I'm beginning to feel like it's not a person doing this. It's the tree, the oak itself, that ancient, malevolent thing back there in my yard, is handing me a gift, a freeing solution to whatever unnamed baggage I have. My life hasn't been easy, a marriage gone wrong, a career that isn't going anywhere, loneliness that grows deeper by the year. Perhaps the tree knows this and senses my vulnerability. Maybe it preys on it. I know I should leave, sell the house, shred my bags, and flee as far as I can from the oak. But I'm trapped, stunned with fear and a morbid curiosity. What happens if I give in? What would happen if I accepted this tree's invitation? I'm drawn to the window and stare at the oak, silhouette out there stark against pre-dawn sky. The noose swings, a dark pendulum ticking toward the inevitable. It's more pungent now, filling the room, filling my lungs. It's the smell of earth and decay, but there's something else too, a faint, almost imperceptible hint of release. When I close my eyes, I see the oak in my mind's eye, branches stretching out, calling me ever closer. The noose waiting there, dangling. I know I should fight it. I know I should resist, but the pull is too strong. The temptation of oblivion is far too alluring. When the sun just starts to illuminate the sky, I am walking to the back door. The air is cool against my skin, carrying the smell of damp earth and the hint of something different. The oak waits, branches outstretched, gift on display. I don't know what awaits me, but I know that I cannot run anymore. It's time to take a look at the hanging tree. It's time to accept its gift, the thing that wears skin. Buster has been a great eater his whole life, a golden retriever with a cast iron stomach. He would hoover up anything edible, whether fallen crumbs or misplaced socks, to my great dismay. But in recent weeks, his appetite had been off, ravenous, frenzied, and it wasn't just food. He'd been chewing on furniture, ripping up the garden, and barking at shadows. Then the growl directed at me. It happened last Tuesday. I had just stepped up to retrieve his leash, eager to head out for our nightly walk, when he showed me his teeth, a low, guttural growl vibrating in his chest. It wasn't the playful mock aggression he sometimes projected. This was pure, visceral hatred. It was fear, hard and loud, twisting in my gut. I flinched, and Buster, after a beat of confusion, whined and licked my palm, tail wagging tentatively. I discounted it as a fluke and wrote it off as his being tired or cranky. But the sensation persisted, a ball of discomfort that tangled more tightly with every day. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He would bark, obsessively, in the direction of the woods that bordered my property, a primal, panic-stricken sound that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. He'd resist going inside at night, instead choosing to hunker down on the porch, eyes turned toward the tree-line, a low growl perpetually bubbling in his throat. Ultimately, I brought him to the vet. Dr. Evans, a woman who had seen it all in her 30 years of practice, simply smiled knowingly as I fretted over doggy anxiety. She ordered some routine blood work and examined his teeth. Then she called me back an hour later, her voice cracking. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "I need you to return to the clinic. We need to discuss Buster's dental scraping results." The words human DNA loomed like a shroud. Dr. Evans, who is typically so serene and composed, was visibly rattled. She described the tests, the confirmations, the unfathomable truth. Buster, my sweet, goofy Buster, had somehow eaten human tissue. "It can be anything," she suggested, her tone punctuated with a strained optimism. "Roadkill, maybe? Or he digs up something in the woods." But neither of us was convinced. Buster never scavenged. He was fed carefully and was walked under supervision, and the DNA was not your ordinary human DNA. The lab did additional analysis. Replacing those 2 digits showed a partial match to a local resident, in particular to my neighbor, Mr. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy was a quiet, unassuming man who lived alone in the old Victorian house up the road. He had always been cordial, waving hello from his porch and giving me vegetables from his garden. I hadn't seen him for several days, but I'd figured he was simply staying to himself, as he so often did. Now a terrifying picture blossomed in my brain. Buster, his teeth slicked with gore, that low growl, the barking frenzy of the woods. That night I couldn't sleep. The house creaked and groaned. Every shadow seemed to twist into some menacing shape. Mr. Abernathy, his wave, his gentle smile. And I kept thinking of Buster, the human DNA, the woods. At around 3 a.m., I heard it. A gentle scratching at the back door. Buster whined, a low actuating sound. I looked through the peephole. Mr. Abernathy stood on my porch, illuminated in the pale moonlight. Or at least something vaguely resembling Mr. Abernathy. His posture was wrong, stiff, and unnatural. His normally gentle, crinkled eyes were wide and glassy, catching the light of the moon like polished stones. And there was a thin, almost indiscernible ripping at the corners of his skin, a pinching between flesh and something else. He smiled, slowly and deliberately, without his eyes. "Can I come in, neighbor?" he croaked, his voice a garbled parody of Mr. Abernathy's recognizable register. His voice was like a cheap suit someone was wearing, seemed straining against the effort. Buster went ballistic. He launched himself against the door, barking and snarling, a furious cacophony of rage and terror. He knew. He was aware of what loomed there on the other side. I didn't open the door. I haven't gone out since then. I boarded the windows, armed myself with a shotgun, and waited. Buster is my sole companion, a quaking, terrified shadow by my feet. He still growls at me sometimes, the same guttural rumble, and now I get it. He's not growling at me. He's growling for me. He's protecting me from what used to be Mr. Abernathy, the thing that now roams through the woods, the thing that wears skin. Sometimes I can hear it shuffling in the leaves, calling my name in Mr. Abernathy's voice. It's patient. It knows I can't remain locked away eternally, and I know with a shivering certainty that it will eventually come past the skin. It will wear my face next. The deep fake. My phone's constant buzzing thumped against the crappy laminate of my bedside table, pulling me out of fitful sleep. Before it grabs my whole screen, light burning my eyes, a deluge of notifications, text messages, emails, news alerts, social media mentions, all blaring the same thing. My name, murder, confession. My heart thudded against my ribs. It had to be a mistake, some kind of sick joke. But the sheer volume, the relentless tsunami of digital noise, seemed foreboding. The first link I clicked was a news article that had a grainy image rendered as its thumbnail. A recognized face looked back at me. My face. Before tapping the play button, I hesitated, a cold dread coiling in my gut. The video opened a little shakily as if shot on the sly. And then I was sitting in a dark room and shadows were making ugly shapes on the wall behind me. I was now wearing a t-shirt I hadn't seen in years. My normally trimmed hair was unkempt and lank. And I was talking. "It was an accident," the figure on screen said, my voice low and raspy. "I didn't expect it to happen. We were arguing. Things got heated, and..." The video cut out for a second and returned to me with my head in my hands, crying without making a sound. "God, I'm so sorry, Sarah. I just panicked." Sarah Miller, my ex-girlfriend, for the one who up and disappeared 6 months ago. The one the police interviewed me for, then dismissed foul play. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a prank. This was a carefully constructed nightmare. I played the video over and over, each time hoping to catch an inconsistency, to find some telltale sign of manipulation. But the more I watched it, the more I was convinced that it was me. The way I shrugged, the nervous tick I did when I was lying, the slight tremor I found in my voice when I was upset, they were all there. Then, right at the end of the video, just before it faded to black, the figure on the screen looked straight into the camera. A slow, deliberate wink. A wink I knew I could never do. My stomach lurched. "You'll get the blame," the figure mouthed. Their words barely a whisper, but real all the same. Panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't real, but it felt real. It looked real. And in the court of public opinion, that's all that mattered. I had frantically scrolled through comments, a flood of accusations and denunciations. "Monster! Lock him up! Justice for Sarah!" The mob was online, and they were calling for my blood. There's no way to reach anybody at the other end of this telephone call. Just tears and someone breathlessly calling the police. This video, it's not me. It's a deep fake. I didn't kill Sarah." The officer on the other end sounded weary. "We've watched the video, Mr. Harding. We'll have to bring you in for questioning." Questioning. That was polite for arrest. I knew I was in deep trouble. Proving I hadn't done something so convincingly real seemed impossible. This was not merely a bad dream. It was a technological lynching. For days afterward, my life was a living hell. The media had a stake outside my apartment with their cameras, flashing away. They doxed me, my address, my phone number, everything. I got death threats, hate mail, and unceasing torrents of abuse. I found myself judged, convicted, and sentenced by a digital jury I couldn't even confront. The police investigation, in the meantime, dragged on. They studied the video, solicited opinions from experts, but came away unenlightened. The AI was too good. It had absorbed my mannerisms, my speech patterns, and even my subconscious tells. It had built me a clone so credible that it was impossible to tell me from me. My lawyer, an old warhorse with a world-weary demeanor, was frank. "This is going to be hard, Mark. The video is damning. We must find concrete evidence to break your alibi. What happened the night Sarah disappeared?" I told him about the poker game with my friends again. They backed up my story, but it wasn't enough. The deepfake eclipsed everything. Doubt was at the root, and like a malignant weed it was flourishing. One night, barely sleeping, my eyes haunted by the digital face, I resolved to take drastic action. I needed to know how this occurred. I had to find the source. I was plunged into the depths of the dark web, a digital underworld of hackers, conspiracy theorists, and purveyors of illegal content. It was a dangerous place, but I was down to nothing. I lost myself for hours in the depths of forums and ran through cryptic messages with the breadcrumbs of who knows what and reached out to shadowy figures. Eventually, I found someone who said they had a lead in the deepfake. Ghost in the machine, user handle after all. An entire world of uncertainty had opened up before us. Our two planets communicating over encrypted channels, every single message leaving me more terrified than the last. The tech itself is out there, Ghost in the machine said. But the really convincing stuff, that needs access. All your digital footprints, your social media, your emails, everything. Someone wanted to kill you, Mark, and they had the means to do it. He'd sent me one line of code, a snippet from the AI algorithm that made the video. There, buried within it, was a timestamp, a digital signature that directed to a specific server in a private, offshore data center. Armed with this information, I returned to my lawyer. He didn't believe me, but he said he would look into it. A few days later, he called, his voice serious. "We found something, Mark. The server is owned by a company named Mimic Technologies. They focus on an AI-powered marketing and reputation management. Reputation management. The read more, an evasion of character assassination. The rabbit hole deepened. They were a front company, a shell corporation funded by an anonymous benefactor. The trail was intentionally hidden, but I was getting closer. Then one night, while going through old pictures of Sarah and me, I saw it, a minor detail barely noticeable. A reflection in a window, a view of a parked car down the street. Car I recognized. Sarah's new boyfriend, a rich and powerful businessman with a violent past. It all clicked into place. He was jealous, possessive. He wanted Sarah back, and nothing, and no one would stand in his way, including me. The evidence remained circumstantial, but it was sufficient. Police finally had a new suspect. Faced with the evidence, the businessman denied it all. But the pressure had begun to build. What was once regarded as undeniable evidence of my wrongdoing was now revealed for the weapon of revenge it truly was. A manipulated deepfake. Collaborative logic was a slow-burning ember. My reputation ruined, my life forever changed. The deepfake had done its damage, even if its maker was ultimately brought to justice. And sometimes at night, when the shadows frolic on my wall, I still see that winking face. A constant reminder of what technology wields, and of the terrifying truth that anyone, anywhere, can simply be erased, replaced, and framed for a crime they never committed, and without a single trace. The deepfake might be revealed, but the fear, the stain, lingers. I will not trust a reflection again for a long while. The subway passenger. The train doors hissed open, a mechanical exhalation that welcomed the familiar swell of weary commuters. I crammed aboard the 617 from Grand Central, settling into my customary place by the grimy window. Another day, another dollar closer to oblivion. I'm not one for romance. Life, in my view, is merely a slow, methodical march to the grave, interspersed with tepid café au lait and the sporadic bill shock. But recently, my banal day-to-day has been interrupted. By him. He gets on at 14th Street every single time. Long-limbed and bony, his eyes devouring all the light in the carriage. Every night he dons the same impeccably tailored charcoal gray suit, yet somehow dated, like a scene from a monochrome film. And whoever it is sits opposite me, never says a word, never smiles, just looks. Initially, I considered him a harmless eccentric. New York's teeming with them, but his gaze, it's unnerving, or like intense, gyring, unwavering, like he's reading some great, dark secret about me. I've attempted to catch his eye, to give him a polite nod, but he all but continues staring, disconcerting intensity never budging. Last week, it reached a whole new level of creepiness. The train was crowded, the air heavy with old sweat and despair. I was tired, my head lolling against the window. I must have dozed off because I awakened with a start to discover something on my lap. A photograph. It was me, asleep, on the train. My mouth was barely open, my eyes half closed, my face slack, vulnerable. It was grainy, almost period, and the lighting terrible, but there was no ignoring it. It was me, taken on this very train. Panic clawed at my throat. I scoured the carriage, finally locking eyes on him. He was still sitting over there, across the aisle, watching me. He didn't respond, didn't flicker of any kind, just kept staring, the same unnerving intensity searing into me. Before I could accuse him, the train came to a screeching halt at my stop. I jumped off, clutching the photograph like a hot ember. I didn't sleep that night. I stared and stared at the picture, wondering how it could have been taken. Was he following me? Stalking me? And why? The next day, I was a mess. My colleagues kept inquiring whether I was all right, but I found it impossible to tell them. They'd think I was crazy. So, I just mumbled something about a bad dream and overdosed on caffeine. That night, I considered going home by cab. Anything not to take the train, not to see him. But my bank account was hollering louder than my fear. So here I was again on the 617, heart pounding against my chest. He was there. Of course, he stepped on at 14th Street, the same as ever. The same gray suit, the same haunted eyes. He sat across from me, and his gaze was heavier than ever. This time, I was ready. I got up, trying not to pay attention to the sly looks of the other passengers. "I'm sorry," I said, the tremor in my voice audible. "Did you drop this?" I held up the photograph. He didn't answer, didn't even blink, just stared. A mixture of fear and frustration washed over me. "Listen, I don't know what your deal is, but this is stalking. This is harassment. If you don't leave me alone, I'm going to call the cops." Still nothing. I was ready to blow when the conductor passed through the carriage, checking tickets. He was an older man, the sort who looked like he'd seen it all. I figured I had nothing to lose. "Pardon me," I set his attention. "Do you know this man?" I gestured to the figure seated across from me. The conductor looked. His face paled. He stepped back, a hand flying to his mouth. "Him?" he said. "Him? He's been dead for years." I glanced at the conductor, then at the figure across the aisle. Still staring, still silent. My blood ran cold. What do you mean?" I stammered. The conductor gulped, his eyes wide with fear. "He used to ride this line, every night. Same suit, same seat. He was killed in a construction accident in '88, barely a stone's throw from the 18th Street station. His body was unrecognizable." He stepped back, his face awash with fear. I gotta go." He rushed away, exiting into the next carriage. I was alone with him. I glanced back at the figure before me. He was standing there, still staring. But his eyes looked different now. Less intense, perhaps. Sadder. Suddenly, I understood. He wasn't stalking me. He wasn't trying to scare me. He was lost, trapped, rehashing his daily commute for eternity. The train came screeching to a halt at my station. I stood up, my legs shaky. I turned back to him one last time. "Goodbye," I whispered. "I hope you find peace." So I stepped away from the train and didn't look back. But his eyes were on me, a cold, lingering presence that trailed me to my door. I never saw him again. But whenever I take the subway, I always sneak a look across the aisle, just in case. Just in case the guy in the gray suit is still looking for his stop. And I wonder if perhaps just maybe he did finally get it. Or if he's cursed to ride that train, looking for something he can never find, forever. The Wi-Fi signal. The anxiety began quietly, a hum beneath the surface of my normally placid existence. It was the kind of anxiety that simmers from too much screen time, too much doom scrolling, too much connectedness. That's likely why I saw the new Wi-Fi signal in the first place. I live alone in a converted Victorian house. High ceilings, drafty windows, and an overall sense that someone or something had inhabited this space long before me. I'd attributed it to age-related jitters, the sort you experience when floorboards creak and shadows flutter in the periphery. But the Wi-Fi signal, that was different. On my laptop, my normal network, stable connection, appeared as usual, reliably. But then, beneath that, one that lurked, thunderstorm. The capitalization was disconcerting, salacious even. At first, I brushed it off as a neighbor's prank, some juvenile effort to scare whoever was within earshot. I even renamed my own network to ignore_them, simply to be passive parent back. But _me persisted. Days passed into weeks and the signal persisted obstinate. And the humming anxiety in me started to intensify. After that, I started researching Wi-Fi intrusions, network security, and the dark web. My paranoia inspired my research, and my research fed my paranoia. One night, sleep eluded me. The old house creaked around me, every groan a secret in the dark. I was sleepless. I picked up my laptop, its light shining on my face in the dark, and lo and behold, me lured me in with its digital siren song. A chill ran through me from head to toe. I knew I shouldn't. I knew it was going to be a mistake to tap that connection. Yet the compulsion was irresistible, a morbid curiosity I had to embrace. I clicked, connect. It was an instant connection. No password required. A red flag crying out in my brain. But the connection was made. I held my breath, waiting for something. Pop-up ad? Continuing on to some bizarre website? Nothing. The internet appeared to be operating as usual. The relief swept me in but was soon followed by a deeper, more sinister discomfort. If it was a joke, it was pretty much the best one ever. Then the green light on my webcam blipped on. My blood ran cold. I hadn't activated it. I hadn't even used any apps that would need it. Panic grabbed my throat and blocked my airway. I clicked desperately on the little pop-up window in the corner of my screen, the one that displayed a live feed from my webcam. There I was, my own face, looking pale and grotesque in the dim light. My room, familiar and soothing only seconds before, now seemed foreign and threatening. I frantically pressed the end video button to no avail. The green light stayed firmly lit, and then I saw it, deep in the back of the feed, half hidden in the shadows of my cluttered closet. Something moved, a flicker, shifting darkness. I put a hand to my mouth, gasping. I squinted, trying to penetrate the gloom. It was a face, not a human face, not precisely, more like a caricature. Wide, unseeing eyes, a grotesquely oversized mouth twisted in a silent, mocking grin. I could hardly see the details, the resolution of the webcam too low, the shadows too deep. But I saw enough, more than enough. I slammed the laptop closed and pressed my palm against my heart, which was pummeling my rib cage like a caged songbird. I stumbled backward, away from the desk, away from the unblinking eye in the closet. I wanted to scream, but the sound became lodged in my throat, a strangled whimper. All I could do was stand there plastered to the wall, listening. The house was silent aside from the frantic pounding of my own heart. Was it still there? Was it moving? Was it coming closer? I had to leave. Now, my hands were trembling so severely that I fumbled for my keys. I staggered out of my room, down the creaking stairs, and out the front door, gulping for breath like a drowning man. I didn't stop running until I made it to the brightly lit corner store a few blocks away. I gasped through the night air, shivering as I stood there. I got to the store where the fluorescent lights felt like a blessed reprieve from my house that was dark and suffocating. I haven't been back since. I now stay in cheap motels going from town to town. I destroyed my laptop, smashed it to pieces with a hammer, hoping to wipe out any evidence of that thing. I've even thought about changing my name, going completely off the grid. I still catch a glimpse of it sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, a flash of that hideous grin, a rustle of movement in the darkness. I know it's purely my imagination, a cruel trick of my mind, but I can't escape the sensation that it's still watching me, still linked, somehow, to the Wi-Fi signal. I'm fully unplugged from the internet. Not a phone, not a laptop, not a smart device. I'm living in the age of payphones and paper maps, and it's a solitary life apart from the connected universe. But you can't put a price on a sliver of peace, one fragile shield against the horrors the unseen corners of the internet were scuttling, waiting for someone to thunderstorm, because now I understand. It wasn't only the webcam that was on. It was me. I was the one being watched, and I'm afraid that whatever looked at me that night will never really let me go. The dark web delivery. The cardboard was nothing to write home about. Brown paper, taped on the fly, no return address. I almost threw it on the donation pile without a second thought. But the weight of it, surprisingly heavy for its size, gave me pause. I'd ordered a new desk lamp online. Was it that? I ripped the tape open with my keychain knife, excitement bubbling up. There were not bubble wrap and a sleek modern lamp, but black packing peanuts and a small old-timey television set. Not a flat screen, not by a long shot. A behemoth cathode ray tube monstrosity that appeared to have been fished out of a flea market in 1980. Bewildered, I searched deeper, turning up a single slip of paper. A URL, rendered in a chillingly sterile font, and below it, a sentence that turned the blood in my veins to ice. "We're inside. Let's play." My initial instinct was to call the police, but there was something so ominous about the simplicity of the message, something so jarring about the presence of the archaic television, that I hesitated. I didn't want to sound crazy. I connected the TV to the wall, a ball of dread twisting in my stomach. The screen popped to life, static blaring in a sickly long moment. Then the static coalesced into an image. A live feed, my living room. My heart pounded against my ribs. The angle was odd, higher than my normal vantage point. It wasn't one of my security cameras. This was inside my house. I froze, staring at the screen. Hands shaking, I reached for my phone, but the image on the television changed. I focused on my phone, which rested on the coffee table, just a few inches from where I stood. A disembodied hand, pale and creepily motionless, slid into frame and covered the phone. A new message appeared at the bottom of the screen. "Don't call them. Let's spice this up a bit." I gasped in my throat. They could see me. They were watching me. The terrifying understanding that I was not alone, that my refuge had been invaded, smacked into me with the force of a physical blow. I pulled back from the TV and, eyes flitting a few times, looked about the room, hunting for a sign of incursion. The curtains were drawn, the shadows deep. Every creak of the house, every crackle of leaves outside the window sounded like footsteps coming closer. The screen flickered again. This time, the feed revealed my hallway, the one that leads into my bedroom. The camera was positioned just below the ceiling, providing a distended, wide-angle perspective. At the end of the hall, my bedroom door swung open, slow and deliberate, a slight crack. Terror propelled me forward. Adrenaline kicked in and I ran down the hallway. I needed to protect my space, my sanity. I burst into the bedroom, prepared to face nothing. The room was empty. My bed was made and the curtains pulled tight. Nobody could have stayed hidden in here. One thing struck me as odd. A small, black box was resting on my nightstand. I approached it cautiously, Another delivery, another twisted game? This time, no note, no message. Just a small, unassuming box. I picked it up, its smooth, cold surface sending shivers into my spine. In the living room again, I stared at the TV screen, which now zoomed in on my face, box clutched in my hand. Open it, the message replied. My hands trembled as I fought with the lid. Inside, cradled in a cape of red velvet, were a single object, a silver locket. Scenic pastoral beauty, rolling hills, grazing sheep, a little cottage, was worked in intricate engravings on its surface. It looked antique, valuable, totally inappropriate within this grotesque game. I opened the locket. Where there had been a photograph was a small, folded piece of paper. I opened it slowly, my heart thumping inside of my ribs. The message, inscribed in what appeared to be childish handwriting, was simple: turn around. Every muscle in my body was crying out in protest, yet some force I could not resist forced me to comply. I slowly spun, my eyes scanning the room, and there they were. Two figures stood in the doorway to my living room, lit only by the dim light from the hallway. Silhouetted, opaque, but most definitely there. One was tall and willowy, the other not so much, almost childlike. They didn't speak. They didn't move. It was like they were just standing there, looking at me with the aura of terrible, unholy malice. My own face was on the television screen, captured in a mask of abject terror. The last message scrolled along the bottom. The game has just begun. Then the screen went black. The dollhouse replica. The cardboard box rested innocently in the porch swing, bound with twine. No address, no return label. Just a box that seemed to thrum with wrongness. That nagging cat, curiosity, eventually led me to snip the twine. Inside, cradled in packing peanuts, was an exact replica of my house. Aside, only the outside, but the inside too, my weathered blue siding, the slightly off-center mail slot, the pitted paint on the windowsills, all reproduced with eerie accuracy. I even recognized the faux vintage rug I'd splurged on last month in the living room. It was a dollhouse, but a dollhouse terrifyingly intimately scaled. I was just really fascinated at first. I looked through the small windows, inspecting the mini furniture, the carefully arranged knickknacks. Then I noticed the family. Little, nearly invisible people living in the house. A woman with my burnished hair, a man who looked like my husband, Tom, and a wee child who seemed to me to be a shrunken-up version of our dog, Buster, if floppy ears were any indication. They were frozen in place, a plastic tableau of domesticity. The woman was at the little stove, the man was in the armchair, Buster was at his feet, all perfectly still. When insomnia caught up with me that night, I was obsessively spinning the dollhouse in my mind. Finally, I couldn't resist, and I crept outside. As I drew closer, I heard a faint, high-pitched sound. It took me a second to recognize it as screaming. I leaned my ear against the dollhouse. The screaming was definitely inside. I was holding my breath and looked into the window. The woman, my miniature doppelganger, was frozen in a silent scream, her mouth a black O of fear. The man was bent in a similar way. His plastic face was a mask of silent horror. Even Buster was whimpering, his little tail between his legs. The sound stopped soon after I moved away. I stared, heart thudding in my chest, as the little figures settled back into their placid poses. Stove, armchair, floor. They had given that scream just for me in person when I did not look directly at them. For days I was obsessed. I would run out to the porch trying to catch them in action. Sometimes I'd hear the screams, a cacophony of tiny terror, but the times I looked, they were still. Tom thought I was losing it. He kept insisting it was just a well-built dollhouse, the type you could buy from some nameless admirer. He even tried to persuade me that it was a clever bit of marketing for a local antique store. But I knew better. This was something much more sinister. Then this morning I saw it. I hadn't planned to look. I was walking Buster in the morning when something sparkling from inside the dollhouse caught my attention. I sank to my knees, heart pounding, and looked inside. The woman was sprawled on the small living room rug. Her dark hair had fanned out around her head. A tiny, red stain spread on her chest. She was dead, but it wasn't the scene of mini carnage that chilled my blood. It was the face. The face did not look twisted in terror like before. It was nice, bordering on tranquil. It was my face. Nervous, I reached out and touched the glass of the dollhouse window. A feeling of dread, cold and acute, swept through me. This wasn't just a dollhouse. This was a warning, premonition. I stumbled backward, knocking over a potted plant. Disclaimer: Buster barked nervously at the freshly dug dirt. I needed to tell Tom. I had to get out of this house. But just as I turned toward the door, I noticed something else moving in there. My tiny, child-sized Tom was standing over my motionless double. What he was holding was a miniature knife, glinting in the dim morning light. He rotated his plastic head, a work of miniature engineering impossible in real life, and regarded me. The flickering promise of silence, and a silent promise, played itself out across his painted eyes. I screamed. This time it was not miniature, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that the next time I looked, I wouldn't be looking through the dollhouse window. I would be inside. The cursed tattoo, to be marked by the hush and hum of a tattoo needle, was meant to signal a merit badge, a proof of endurance. A snake, wrapped protectively around a blooming rose, representing rebirth after a brutal breakup. I had painstakingly chosen the design, the artist, and the spot, my left bicep. Now, a week later, I was regretting every one of them. It started subtly. Twitches. A phantom itch Benadryl wouldn't quiet. I attributed it to healing, a normal annoyance. But then came the movement. I remember the first time I saw it. I was looking in the bathroom mirror, mesmerized by the intricacies of the scales. There was a distinct ripple down the serpent's back, a ripple that could not be denied. I blinked, wondering if I was imagining things. I wasn't. It happened again. I thought I was going insane. I Googled moving tattoos for hours, but found only ridiculous conspiracy theories and bad horror movie plotlines. I even returned to the tattoo artist, a brusque woman named Brenda who reeked of cigarettes and antiseptic. Movement? What are you saying, kid? It's ink under your skin. It doesn't move. She peered at my arm, brow furrowed. Looks fine to me. Just keep it clean and moisture. But it wasn't fine. It was horrifying. The serpent was no longer just rippling. It was moving, imperceptibly but unmistakably, its head creeping slowly north, toward my elbow. Then came the dreams. Vivid, nightmarish dreams of writhing snakes and a persistent, hissing whisper. I opened my eyes drenched in sweat with the sensation of small scales still brushing against my skin. I began sleeping with the lights on, hoping to catch the tattoo in the act. One night, I jolted awake, the sensation of pressure on my wrist. I switched on the lamp, my pulse pounding in my chest. There it was. The serpent's head had slipped away from my elbow. It was midway up my forearm, glazed, obsidian eyes appearing to glare directly at me. I began to keep a journal, documenting the snake's progress. Each entry got more frantic, more desperate. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a tattoo. Last night was the worst. I fell asleep tired, the journal gripped in my hand. This time, there was no vision, no gentle hissing. Instead, there was a voice, clear and distinct, echoed directly in my mind. I'll reach your heart soon. I sat bolt upright in bed, breathless. The tattoo had a reptilian coldness to it, like an animal draped over my skin. My hands shaking, I rushed to the mirror. The snake was now just beneath my shoulder. Its movements were growing more vigorous, more frequent. I could almost see it breathing, its scales flashing in the half-light. Panic seized me. I needed a way to intervene and prevent it. But how? Brenda had dismissed me. The internet was useless. Who would believe me? Then it hit me as I looked at myself in the mirror. The issue was more than just raw motion. It was the feeling, the insidious dread that the serpent was implanting in my soul. The fear was feeding it, and every day it got stronger. I knew I had to fight back. I had to cut the cord, break the curse. But how? A desperate thought flared in my mind. The tattoo had to do with rebirth, a fresh start. Maybe I had to face the past, the pain that made me get the tattoo to begin with. I opened my journal to the first entry post-breakup. I started to write not about the tattoo, but about the relationship, the good and the bad, the hurt and the healing. I wrote until my hand was cramped, sweating every last tear. I risked a glance at my arm as I wrote. The snake faltered, movement becoming sluggish. Could it be? Was it responding to my honesty, my vulnerability? So I wrote and wrote and wrote some more, digging deeper, diving deeper, sitting in anguish with the horrors too terrifying for me to unveil. When I turned the last page, I felt a strange tranquility. The serpent was still. I looked at my arm. The tattoo did not leave. A black serpent coiled around a vibrant rose. But something had shifted. All that angry energy was gone. The dread had subsided. The serpent no longer represented a threat. It was now a reminder, a symbol of the strength I had discovered in myself. I still don't know what placed a curse on the tattoo, but I broke the curse because I faced my fears. The serpent will never go away completely, but it's not running the show for me anymore. It is just part of my journey, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope, like the rose, comes alive. And at times, to beat a monster is simply to know it. The lockbox under the floor. The old house creaked a symphony of settling skeleton wood and whistling wind, a tune I'd grown used to in the 2 years I'd lived here. But last week, a new section had joined the ensemble. A low, rhythmic rattle that clawed its way into my slumber at midnight sharp. It all began with the lockbox. I'd been pursuing a nagging draft that was sending icy fingers up from the basement. Tracking the trail of icy air, I had freed a loose floorboard by the foundation. Beneath all that, embedded in the moist earth, was a rusted metal box, the size of a loaf of bread. The surface was pitted and corroded, the hinges solidly frozen. Curiosity, that ancient siren, sang. After an hour spent prying and hammering, the lockbox gave way. In the nestling of worn velvet were a few teeth, human teeth, molars, incisors, canines, an incongruous assortment, darkened brown and yellowed with age. My stomach lurched. Who would hold on to something like that? What kind of twisted tale did these teeth tell? Then I saw the note, folded and yellowed with age, scrawled in a spidery hand. It said, "Don't open me again." A chill was more raking than the basement draft crawled down my spine. I closed the lockbox hard, the rusty latch clicking with finality, and burying it back under the floorboard, handed myself the board and tried scrubbing it away. And at midnight that night, the rattling started. A quiet, nagging rattle from below the floorboard. It sounded as though something was trying to get out, scratching against the metal walls of the lockbox. The first night, I went rigid with fear, gripping the edge of the bed. On the second night, I plugged my ears, hoping to replace it with music. But the rattling continued, an unending vibration reverberating in my ears and in the very marrow of my bones. Now, on the fifth night, I was sitting on the basement stairs with a hammer and a flashlight, my heart beating a frantic tattoo against my ribs. The rattling began anew, right on cue, this time louder, fretful. I inched up to the floorboard, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. The noise was coming from inside the box. Now it wasn't just teeth rattling. There was a scraping, a scratching, a desperate appeal held within that rusted prison. Who's there? The rattling was so loud that I could hardly hear myself speak. Silence. Then another sound, a faint, choked-up whimper. There was something alive in the box. With a morbid curiosity that swayed towards madness, I knelt next to the floorboard, the hammer heavy in my hand. I knew I shouldn't open it. The note had warned me, but the desperation coming from the box was too powerful. I pried the floorboard loose with trembling fingers. The rusted lockbox remained, full of uneasy vibrations. This time, the latch was a little unlatched, as if something were at work from inside. I took a deep breath and forced the latch open. The lid creaked back, hinges protesting a scream. The inside was illuminated by the flashlight beam. The teeth were strewn everywhere, and in the middle was nothing. A space, and a single new drop of blood held on the velvet lining. Panic seized me. Whatever was there, trapped in that lockbox, was gone. Then I heard it, a soft, wet sound behind me, a dragging sound, as if something was pulling itself across the wet concrete of the floor. I turned gradually, my flashlight beam slicing the dark, and there, on the edge of the light, I spotted them. Two burning eyes, staring at me dead in the beam, the row of impossibly sharp teeth stretching well past what should have been a human jaw. And from its lips came a whisper, a rasping echo of the note I had discovered but changed, warped into a terrible promise. "Thank you for letting me in again." And just like that, the storm fades, but the dread lingers. If you're still breathing, you've survived this descent into darkness, but the night is far from over. Subscribe and ring that bell unless you want the next tale to find you unprepared. Tell us below, which story haunted you most? Share this video with someone who claims they don't fear the dark. Then watch their courage crumble. Until next time, keep one eye open. The shadows are always listening.